And now, a really important moment of the day is our first official conference from Mr. Paul Carr. I would just like to say a few words about Mr. Carr before giving him the mic. So Mr. Paul Carr is a full professor in the Department of Educational Science at the Université du Québec in Outaouais. He's the holder with Gina of the UNESCO Chair in Democracy, Global Citizenship and Transformative Education, the first UNESCO Chair of UCO, specializing in political sociology of education. His research fields include school institutional culture, education for democracy, citizenship education, intercultural education, transformative education, media literacy, and cities for peace and environmental education. So we're really happy to have him. So here you go, Paul. It's your turn.
Voilà, many thanks, Julie, Madame Barbieri. Bonjour tout le monde. Au plaisir, je suis ravi d'être ici avec vous pour ouvrir notre symposium. On va avoir du temps au cours des 5 prochains jours pour féliciter, célébrer, remercier tout le monde. Muchas gracias a todo el mundo de estar aquí. Es un gran placer para mí de abrir nuestro simposio. Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to be here with you all, and I'm thrilled to be able to open our symposium. We'll have much time over the next 5 days to celebrate and congratulate, and also to thank those who are with us. I'm going to jump right into the presentation. The pandemic and insurrectional democracy, are we better than that? Okay, yeah. Voilà. So I want to start by asking, what are we here for? Why are we on this planet? What is happening? And I have 2 answers. The very simple one is that it's love. We're here for that. And the more complex answer is that we really need to think this through. Is the glass half full or half empty? Do we really know? And what do we do with the elephant in the room, or the elephants in the room, or are we even in a room? So what are the vantage points that we're using to inform how we think about the world? And this picture is of a very younger me, some 25 years ago in Havana, Cuba, with some school children. And this really impacted me. I've been to Cuba many, many times. And in the solidarity movement. So this is something that has impregnated itself in my thinking, and we all have experiences throughout our lives that somehow inform our theoretical, conceptual, experiential vantage points. So what history do we look at? This map here is of the Berlin Conference 1884, in which European countries divided up Africa, and the legacy of colonialism exists. So how do we know what we know, and should we be planting a flag anywhere? And this is really important when we talk about global citizenship. And of course, there's the Mohawk flag in the top there. So can we speak on behalf of anyone or for anyone? There's one of our logos is global citizenship, a conspiracy theory. And I would even argue that political correctness, cancel culture, the emphasis on reverse discrimination are extremely unnecessary distractions to serious, long-standing, entrenched problems. So how do we know how to live together? And this is really fundamental, of course, to the notion of democracy. So life is really complex. It's not binary. We have a lot of intersecting multiple identities. We also have collective identities. And this is a short video of Bolivian girls who are involved in skate culture, and they're commemorating and celebrating the power of women in transforming society and participating in society, and the fight for independence and freedom. We don't often think of people in other circumstances, and this is something that I think is essential. We live in with a lot of paradoxes. I have many. I'll mention a couple, but I like to speak English, French, and Spanish as best as I can, as much as I can. But I also understand that these are colonial languages for many people. I like to live in a house, and yet I don't like negotiating with a bank. I have strong feelings about the environment, yet I have a car. I don't believe in high stakes quantitative evaluations of students and colleagues, and yet runs counter to social justice considerations, yet we're involved in this. And I understand how capitalism is exploitative, and yet I work at a university where the pension will probably be produced in a large part through stock markets. And I don't believe in normative elections, political elections, yet I vote every chance I get. And so I think a lot of paradoxes inform the way that we think about how we live together, and we'll get to this a bit later. So here are a few pieces of the puzzle that I see, but I don't want to impose them on anyone. We're all informed by lots of people, and you probably know all of these people or many of them. I'm going to try to present some facts in quotations, some images, some ideas about the reality and perception that I see. But of course, one man's facts or one woman's facts may be derided as another man's or woman's fake news. But this is what I see. And our friend Noam Chomsky said, nobody is going to pour truth into your brain. It's something that you have to find out yourself. So I'm going to present some of the context of the world that we live in before I address the pandemic and democracy, the context of chaos in the world. And I see two major blocks. One is the planetary destruction caused by humans, and the other is the unlimited, infinite social inequalities that we produce. First is that we've got almost infinite wealth concentration, and this is increasing. Between March 2020 and April 2021, during the global pandemic, the collective wealth of American billionaires increased by over 50% to more than $4.5 trillion, which is more than roughly half of the American population. Government policies that undertax corporations and wealthy individuals and concurrently underfund social programs, education, healthcare, development further aggravate the wealth distribution crisis. Oxfam recently noted that the 22 richest men on earth have more wealth than all of the women in Africa, and that unpaid care work done by women is estimated at almost $11 trillion a year. Wars, we have bloodied our societies and history with this. The Guardian newspaper quote indicates that the 20th century was the most murderous in recorded history. The total number of deaths caused by or associated with its wars have been estimated at 187 million people, the equivalent of more than 10% of the world's population in 1913. According to Brown University, since 9/11, American taxpayers have spent more than $6 trillion on wars and military action in the Middle East and Asia. And there are presently some 200,000 US troops in roughly 800 military bases in 70 countries around the world. Since 2001, there have been more than 115,000 suicides by US veterans, roughly 20 a day. So I've underscored the US here, but this is a global problem. The arms race, according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, total global military expenditure rose to almost $2 trillion in 2020, an increase of 2.6% in real terms from 2019. Many countries value, cultivate, and subsidize the military armaments industry, a very perverse yet relatively secret enterprise. Is there a good reason to increase military spending during a pandemic when gross national product everywhere is shrinking and social needs for billions of people are increasing? So it goes without saying from my perspective, and probably for many other people, that these arms serve no redeeming special social benefit, but to ensure that maiming and killing will continue to be part of the global landscape. Invading countries, according to historians Christopher Kelly and Stuart Laycock, the United States has invaded or fought in 84 of the 193 countries recognized by the United Nations, and has been militarily involved with 191 of the 193 countries, a staggering 98%. My principal concern is that countries are invaded for contradictory reasons, some not at all and others on numerous occasions because of the alignment or lack thereof with the geopolitical hegemonic powers of the day. What would our world be like today if Iraq had not been invaded in 2003? Why is Saudi Arabia not invaded and Yemen is? Why is regime change promoted for one country but not another? Who decides? Selective human rights. How are refugees, political, war, economic, cultural, created? What does war and conflict have to do with it? And can we critique human rights abroad when we have them issues here? Here's a short clip of Jeffrey Sachs talking about this. Ça marche, Carl? No? Ça marche pas? I'll move on, but the clip indicates that there are many human rights issues in the United States, and this is the point that Jeffrey Sachs is making. Environmental catastrophe. According to Earth.org, environmental degradation is both a driver and consequence of disasters, reducing the capacity of the environment to meet social and ecological needs. We are now facing critical problems related to, among others, emissions from vehicles, industry, power plants, as well as methane and other gases from landfills and animal agriculture, hyper-consumption that hampers and destroys our waterways that are littered with toxic waste and chemicals, climate change causing extreme weather, putting at risk public health, ecosystems and water and food resources, deforestation. For example, between 1990 and 2016, we lost about 500,000 square miles of forests, the equivalent of the landmass of South Africa. And this significantly affects wildlife habitat and the sustainability of ecosystems. Food waste is another huge problem. A third of the food intended for human consumption, around 1.3 billion tons of food intended for human consumption is wasted or lost each year, enough to feed 3 billion people, and accounting for 4 gigatons of greenhouse gas emissions. A recent worldwide fund report found that numerous mammals, fish, bird, reptile, and amphibian groups have also experienced a decline of an average of almost 70% between 1970 and 2016. And lastly, the climate crisis is warming the Arctic more than twice as fast as anywhere else on the planet. Water levels are rising on average of more than 3 millimeters per year globally, and it is predicted by the year 2100 that this will climb to between 20 centimeters and 2 meters. Declining species is another serious, important issue that we have to recognize. Our planet now faces a global extinction crisis never witnessed by humankind. Scientists predict that more than 1 million species are on track for extinction in the coming decades. According to the World Wildlife Fund, the rapid loss of species we are seeing today is estimated to be between 1,000 and 10,000 times higher than the natural extinction rate. Humans as a group are maniacally accelerating the extinction of the planet, especially if we continue on the same trajectory. A few examples: scientists estimate that a third or more of all the roughly 6,300 known species of amphibians are at risk. BirdLife International estimates that 12% of roughly 10,000 bird species are also threatened. Roughly 20% of the 1,800 species of fish are deemed at risk. The International Union for Conservation of Nature estimates that half of the globe's roughly 5,500 known mammals are declining in population. 21% of the total evaluated reptiles in the world are deemed endangered. And also plant life and other species. Sexism, misogyny, feminicide. According to the organization UN Women, globally, an estimated almost 1 in 3 women have been subjected to intimate partner violence, non-partner sexual violence, or both at least once in their life. 30% of women aged 15 or older. The figure does not include sexual harassment. This violence leads to depression, anxiety, disorders, unplanned pregnancy, sexually transmitted infections, HIV at higher rates than other women who have not experienced the violence. There are also many other issues as well: human trafficking for the purpose of sexual exploitation, child marriage, female genital mutilation, forced sex, school-related gender-based violence, cyber harassment, psychological violence, discrimination everywhere, and feminicide is also a pandemic. Indigenous peoples, according to the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, at present, 96% of the world's approximately 6,700 languages are spoken by only 3% of the world's population. Although Indigenous peoples make up less than 6% of the global population, they speak more than 4,000 of the world's languages. Conservative estimates suggest that more than half of the world's languages will become extinct by 2100. The majority of these languages are Indigenous languages. There is a direct linkage here between colonialism and colonial practices and the life, culture, and existence of Aboriginal peoples. Through policies of assimilation, dispossession of land, discriminatory laws and actions, Indigenous languages in all regions face the threat of extinction. And there are also other important issues such as health, education, political sovereignty, land rights, well-being, and survival in many cases. Racism, I only want to say it is everywhere. It is also a pandemic. It comes in many forms: colorism, individual, institutional, societal, civilizational, potential. It characterizes the way that we have structured our societies, and it is a central feature to the way that I think we need to think about how do we struggle against anti-racism if we want to achieve a meaningful democracy. White supremacy as well. There are hundreds and hundreds of white supremacist hate groups in the United States, in Canada, throughout Europe. It's a global phenomenon. They're often attached to political parties and political statements and political policies. Also a very troubling piece of what we're seeing now globally. Xenophobia, there's a long history of this in Europe, in the Americas, in relation to immigration. We see now fringes and flinges of this, of hatred and xenophobic acts towards Asian people, but it's something that has happened throughout time. The immigrant experience as well has been thoroughly marinated in xenophobia, an increasing interplay between the mainstream institutions and these hate groups. Poverty, according to the US, to the United Nations and other sources, although there is some improvement in some areas, the portrait of poverty in the world is bleak. Globally, 10% of the world, more than 700 million people, is living on less than $2 a day. For every 1,000 children born, 39 will die before they turn 5 years old. Most under 5 deaths are caused by preventable diseases like malaria, diarrhea, pneumonia. These are caused by malnutrition, contaminated water, poor sanitation and hygiene. Many children, as Madame Barbieri has noted, do not go to school. There are rural-urban inequalities, racial, ethnic, cultural inequalities, linguistic and gender inequalities. Life expectancy is, of course, lower for people living in poverty, and also health indicators and other measures. So the glass is half full. Much is being done, even if we don't hear about it as much. What are we doing? What are we thinking about? I don't want to demoralize anyone. I want to just lay out, these are some of the issues that characterize our lives, our societies, but we also have a lot of important work being done around the world. And I think there's 2 blocks here. One is the endless quest for meaning and social justice, and the other is the power of culture and love. And these are very important mobilizers. First of all, social movements. We've had tremendous social movements in relation to Black Lives Matter, Occupy Wall Street, I Don't Know More, Arab Spring, peace movement, civil rights movement, gay rights movement, Me Too, environmental movements. There's been struggles in Myanmar, Hong Kong, Palestine, around the world. And so there are a lot of people mobilized, and maybe we don't necessarily see it in educational textbooks or pedagogical lessons and so on, but this is a reality. People are mobilized. Organizations as well. There are many people who found organizations, non-governmental organizations, and working in very important areas. I do want to emphasize that we should never confuse charity and charitable giving with volunteerism, and volunteerism with solidarity. Solidarity is a different level of thinking about how we resolve our problems. Teaching and learning. There are many people over the next 5 days who will be talking about this, and there are many excellent, wonderful examples of how people engage through education, how people transform their lives. Of course, our own vantage point with Paulo Freire's work and incredible work is that we're critical of formal education. It has to be more hinged on social transformation, but also there are a lot of wonderful teachers, educators, and people engaged. Cultural innovation. People are so inventive, innovative. Banksy, and you see a library in the middle here. We see Playing for Change. I have a few clips if we're able to get the volume to them. We have various ways that people engage through life and living and culture, and this is what sustains people. Political mobilization. There are many ways that people can mobilize, even formally and informally. Of course, Noam Chomsky warns us, as long as the general population is passive, apathetic, diverted to consumerism or hatred of the vulnerable, then the powerful can do as they please, and those who survive will be left to contemplate the outcome. Scientific discovery. There have been many wonderful innovations that have helped improve life, lifespan, quality of life, and we're seeing as well with the pandemic, there have been many innovations. I think we need to really, really focus on widespread accessibility so the whole world can benefit, but there are many ways that scientific discovery has enhanced our lives. Partnerships and collaboration. There are many ways that people can link together and develop thinking and projects and mobilization and conscientization. Love, friendship, kindness, as well. We're human beings and nobody was born to hate. And I think that we can learn and live, and there is a lot of potential in this area. Of course, sports, art, literature, music, humility. This is what sustains us. Otherwise, we would not live here. See if this will work here. No. Carl? No?
Non, je sais.
Ok. Mais... No. Okay. Unfortunately, I've got some wonderful clips here from Playing for Change that have people around the world singing in harmony, and I do invite you to look at that online. It really is a mastery of how we can think about working together and sharing and cultivating beyond language, beyond culture, beyond geography, and to grow together. This is La Bamba. I think I'm missing a few slides here, Carl. I need. How do I change this? Okay, sorry, yeah. Okay, so social solidarity is the only way out of this dilemma if we want out. And there's no trickle-down quick fix. We're not born racist or sexist, hate-ridden, holding a gun, wishing to kill, or obliged to accumulate untold amounts of wealth. We learn this. And once again, I'm sorry to say I don't think the volume is going to work, but these are students in Colombia reuniting and uniting to fight chaos and oppression and corruption. And it would be wonderful to be able to hear it, but there are examples around the world. I think that what I did in the first part of the presentation is lay out some of these broader contextual issues, but there are many people mobilized around the world. So how we see the world depends on us. What we want to see, do, and change, what we can see, do, and change, and what we are able to see, do, and change. Here is one of our slogans, returning to normal after COVID. What is normal and according to whom? Here is a quote from Arundhati Roy, Indian militant author. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudices and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us, or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. So here we are, the pandemic, and an Indian doctor said, social distancing is a privilege. It means you live in a house large enough to practice it. Hand washing is a privilege too. It means you have access to running water. Hand sanitizers are a privilege. It means you have money to buy them. Lockdowns are a privilege. It means you can afford to be at home. A disease spread by the rich as they flew around the globe will now kill millions of the poor. And we can see how COVID is striking the world, but not necessarily proportionately. And I think there's two major issues, blocks here. One is the management of the problem or the comprehension. The other is the real life consequences. And I'll just briefly discuss a couple of them. The pandemic really has been a day-to-day operational situational issue. And when we think about the management of the issue, this is a multi-transdisciplinary phenomenon. It's not a public health issue, full stop. It's a political issue, an economic issue, a cultural issue, an educational issue, and so on, a scientific one. And also we have to think about who is affected and the communications around this and the deep-seated inequalities that have made this much, much worse than it may have or should have been, although we know that there are many people working on this on the front lines very hard. This is in the far left is the pandemic, 1919, roughly, the Spanish flu. And we can see that a lot of the ways that we've been thinking about the pandemic, it's the unemployment rate, investments, growth, the rise of pharmaceutical companies, the impact on stock markets. And it is really mind-boggling why we don't just open up the patents so that the whole world can be vaccinated. But there is a large resistance. We can see there's been a lot of unnecessary death, senseless resistance in many regards, recalcitrant behavior, disjointed political decision-making, awkward communications, deeply rooted inequalities, and who gets infected, treated, and so on. There's roughly 3.5 million who have died, sadly, but these numbers are probably a gross understatement of the numbers. There's many reasons why the numbers have not been tabulated towards the real feature, the real number. And this is Angelique Kidjo, Goodwill Ambassador from the United Nations, who is also singing about bringing people together for COVID. And it also is a wonderful video. I'm not sure about the why there is some of those issues for the volume. But we can see that the economics has played a significant role in the way that we've looked at handling or understanding the communications, the political communications. It's a worldwide phenomenon. It's not something that we can vaccinate one country, of course. I think everyone understands this quite fully. So what does democracy have to do with all of this? and in the middle of the symbolic violence, when your opinion denigrates mine, how do we engage? And I think that I want to come to this notion of democracy, that we need to dialogue, but not in a superficial way. It has to be in a very substantive, robust way. It has to be built on a meaningful distribution of ideas, resources, and so on. And normative democracy is relates to the normative institutions, voting and political parties and other institutions. And these are highly rejected at this point around the world by many people. How would you define democracy where you are? Do you believe that we are in a democracy with so much chaos, inequality, hatred, and so on? And there are many, the Democracy Index from The Economist and many other indices that help us understand what is it we're talking about. Now, I've emphasized the United States because the United States has played a major role in presenting itself as the leading democracy and the country that can dictate to other countries how it should align with this vision. I'm going to present a couple of notions of democracy here. One is democracy democratic, normative democracy, with so much chaos and corruption and hatred and so little voting amongst people who are able to vote? It's a messy business, but does it have to be that messy? And there is a lot of work being done to try to build democracy, but on the one hand, in education in general, we seem to start from a vantage point that we are in a democracy, and therefore, because of that, we have human rights and so on. It's not an endpoint, it's more of a process, I believe. So what is the point of elections? And I won't spend a lot of time here, but I think there's roughly, I put together 15 arguments against normative elections. There's too much focus on winning, not democracy. Elections are considered an endpoint, not a process. And democracy is not democratic. And just briefly, there's a lot of corruption in elections, and we've seen this most recently in the United States, but elsewhere. There's too much focus on fundraising. When people are fundraising, they're not really engaging with people. They're looking for cash, they're using the cash, they're giving special access to folks. The money really kind of, I'm not sure why there should be a place in elections for money, but traditionally the people who spend the most often win. The focus is on winning. It's not on building a democracy. It's a winner take all. The party that wins, then they have almost endless access to resources and controlling the civil service and ministries and so on, departments. As well, there's hyper polling and marketing. I think it distances people from the notion of building a democracy. It's how to win an election, which is one thing, but it's not related to building a democracy. There's efforts to destroy the other. There's limited representation of all the diversity in societies. Having two parties in a vastly developed, complex society, it really kind of eliminates so many voices. Efforts to restrain voting. There's no interest in those who don't vote. So roughly the 40% who don't vote in Canada, United States, they have no place at the table. They're not really involved in any of the democratic machinations. There's an emphasis on war and defense, can't be questioned. There's a potential for xenophobia, which we've seen in many Western developed countries these last several years. Capitalism is considered non-negotiable. Education for democracy is not a priority. And there's explicit and implicit support for dictatorships, all that run counter to the notion of democracy. Normative media coverage as well is a problem. Are we really better than this? And I think this is what I wanted to say is that often we hear this, especially in US elections, we're better than this, we're better than this. We, when there's shootings or wars. Well, is this a Pygmalion democracy? Are people aspirational? Are they saying we should be better than this? Or are we really better than this? I'm not sure if we're better than this. I think we are this. This is what we've created. These are the systems. These normative democratic systems were not necessarily created to transform societies, although there is much written about this, and I know there will be critiques saying, well, what else can we do? Well, I think there's many things that we can do to not only reform, but transform our societies. Normative democracy on the edge. Here's a report by Sanchez Perez Rodriguez Olivari that look at the varieties of democracy report, and they find that there are more non-democratic than democratic countries, and a majority of the world's population lives under non-democratic regimes at this time. Hungary had a movement recently to install a more authoritarian regime. Latin America has regressed to worse than non-democratic levels than were seen in the early 1990s. They've used a study of polyarchy, which was developed by Robert Dahl, that looks at several indicators: elected officials, clean elections, associational autonomy, inclusive citizenship, freedom of expression, and alternative sources of information, as a way of trying to understand democracy. And as you can see from some of the indicators they provided, there is a movement towards autocratization in many regards. There are some movements, democratic movements, but often we're seeing that often democratic movements are getting trounced and are being removed through formal and informal power structures. Do political leaders lead to substantial political change? Here's a study by Nick Cheeseman based on the Bartelsman Transformation Index Africa Report 2020. And he reviews that there are many countries now where leadership change results in initial waves of optimism, but ongoing political challenges then ensue. There's no one Africa, but he's found that there are many countries in Africa that are heading in the wrong direction for progressive change, although there are some bright lights in West Africa. Blending normative structures with diminished democracy. And here we can see that there have been some reports, for example, in the Polish state about removing the Supreme Court, as well as recently in El Salvador, and basing it on democratic principles. There's different types of regimes now that use democratic rhetoric to put in place policies that distort reality and to create a caste system within these various branches of normative democracy. This is called the advent of authoritarian democracy. So is insurrectional democracy a thing? And we all know or remember or have seen on January 6th what happened in the United States. And the images were quite shocking. And I've tried to put a very brief kind of definition to this, and I'm going to read through it. There's a lot here, but I think that insurrectional democracy, it's arrogance, lack of humility, the belief in superiority, the lack of engagement with the world, the belief in militarization and violence to resolve disputes, the lack of inclusion in political, economic, and socio-cultural decision-making, dicey and nebulous elections prioritized over bona fide participation, nebulous and constrained engagement in relation to social justice-related processes and actions, normative democracy over transformative, critically engaged democracy, excessively high levels of entertainment versus meaningful interaction, diluted neoliberal employment-based education versus transformative, critically engaged education, the cult of a few political parties and personalities versus the potential for massive representation and solidarity, tolerance or even negligence in relation to xenophobic, racist, sexist, hegemonic actions versus cultivating and accepting vibrant citizen mobilization for change, selectively denouncing some and not others, leading to massive deception, cynicism, and boycotting of formal normative institutions, denying reality while continuing to boast about supposed greatness and superiority. All of this together, I believe, is what we're looking at now as insurrectional democracy. Some of the newest tactics used by would-be authoritarians include extending power, executive power, repressing dissent, capturing elite support when needed and demonizing others, appealing to populism and nationalism, controlling information at home and misinformation abroad, crippling the opposition, covert election manipulation, playing the emergency card, creating an emergency to seize power, extending the model that they put, regressive model in place, and learning and sharing from other regimes. So what is it all about? What is happening with humanity? How does it end? Who has the last word? What do we see as a democracy? How do we conjecture the meaning of it? How will we transform our societies? And is there a space for global citizenship, for transformative education? Here are a few considerations in relation to democracy. One is that how we live together is the solution. War is a senseless activity that we continue at our own peril. All living species and cultures are at risk. The environment will continue to degrade with the neoliberal architecture we have. Famine, discrimination, poverty are no longer sustainable. Ending inequality will not happen without struggle. And political leaders, they can be helpful, but we cannot rely on that. And to frame democracy, and I'll just say that Gina Teze and I put together a model here, but I think that we need to have people get together to define themselves. What are the indicators for social justice in relation to racism, sexism, poverty, citizen participation, engagement, elections, education, healthcare, international relations, and so on, governance. And I think that societies need to give to people the power to define what are the indicators of how we look at these issues, rather than to an elected party so that they can decide how we entertain them. And we've written quite a bit on this if you're interested in following up. Here are a few ideas to help reimagine democracy: cooperatives, participatory budgeting, dialogue groups, accountability circles. We need more community gardens and parks, accessible, free, engaged, media portals as well. We need citizen projects aimed to counter hegemony, coalition building across boundaries, community housing for everyone. We need to raise minimum wages and impose maximum wages, develop transformative education. No one can graduate until everyone graduates. We need to rethink education. We need real reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. We need to replace the Defense Department with a peace department, redefine democracy. We need to reestablish what is democracy. The environment should be the cornerstone of all economic and political decisions, as should social inequalities. And casino capitalism, as Henry Giroux states it, should be taxed exorbitantly. So there is a silver lining. And before we perish, before we end, before we leave this planet, we can change, we can learn. There are many examples of solidarity. And we need to think that no one has the last word, no one person, no government. What do you think? What are your proposals to reform the world? As our slogan says, it's not Davos, it's oikos. And Paulo Freire speaks of love as an internal and visceral commitment to changing the world. And lastly, don't be afraid to engage with the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paul. It was really, really interesting. Thank you for sharing your work, your thoughts, your values. It's really inspiring. And we can see the paradox, but we can feel inspired. So I think we're ready to act. And if someone has some questions, comments, other suggestions to inspire us also, we have another 10 minutes before the break and the other session. So if you have any questions, you can put your name or the question in the conversation space. And you can write them down in English, French, or Spanish, and we'll be able to respond to you. While we wait for the questions and comments, I want to say that at first I was maybe a bit depressed by all the information that were coming from your presentation, Paul, but soon I realized that we are all in a paradox and we have to find our own solutions. And as I saw that you proposed some avenues, and I recognize myself in some of them. And some are maybe too big for an individual, but others are really inspiring. And I'm happy because, you know, as an always optimistic person, I think that we share those values. So I'm really happy, and I think that it will inspire everybody here, the 94% listening to you. So I have someone who raised a hand, which is Flavio Galvan. Flavio Galvan, si quiere.
Gracias, Julie. Más que nada un comentario, Paul. Flavio Galván de México. Creo que llego una vez más a la convicción de que lo que hace falta es educación para el pueblo. No puede haber participación ciudadana si el pueblo no está educado. No puede haber una democracia insurrecta si el pueblo es ignorante. Hace falta educación en todo el mundo y educación obviamente para la transformación. Te felicito, Paul.
Sí, gracias, Flavio. Estoy de acuerdo contigo. La cuestión para mí es qué tipo de educación, porque la educación neoliberal bancaria no va a servir a mucho. Necesitamos el nivel, como Freddy dijo, de concientización, de involucramiento, de justicia social, de alfabetización mediática. Y creo que necesitamos la educación en varios niveles y podemos hacerlo. Mi presentación tenía la intención de informarnos colectivamente. Yo hago parte de este colectivo que podemos hacer algo. Y nunca deberíamos no considerar la experiencia de los otros. Yo puedo decir como hombre que no hay sexismo. No es interesante. Necesitamos hablar. Yo puedo decir como blanco que no hay racismo. No podemos continuar a manifestar este nivel de arrogancia y necesitamos abrir las puertas. La educación es el cambio, la agencia de cambio, lo más importante que tenemos, pero es instrumentalizado por el Estado. Entonces necesitamos reapropiarnos de este esfuerzo tan importante, pero es importante para nosotros de tener las perspectivas de todo el mundo para reconstruir. Y yo conozco varios de ustedes. Ustedes están haciendo un trabajo muy importante, muy interesante. Entonces, ¿por qué tenemos sistemas, democracias normativas que no funcionan? Es una pregunta. Gracias, Flavio.
Thank you, both of you. On the chat, we have Tammy Lewis, who asked, you are making an important point when you ask if we have democracies anymore. What ways can we promote deliberation in educational settings?
This is an important question, and I need 7 hours, but I don't have it. I have about 4 minutes. So I think what I'll say is there are many good people doing a lot of good work. And over the next few days, there are many people who are very inspirational. In relation to education, I would say the first thing we need to do is to extricate from ourselves the idea that the teacher has the knowledge. The teacher is a participant in a knowledge construction process. We also have to seriously think about social justice, social inequalities, and that should be the basis of all of our learning, I believe. As Joe Kinchlow said, the study of critical pedagogy is the study of oppression. It doesn't mean much if we can educate in a certain way a small percentage of the population. So I think we have to really consider, what is education? We have to ask ourselves, what is the purpose of education? In Canada, it is inconceivable to think of education without reconciliation with First Nations, without poverty reduction, elimination, without the elimination of racism. These should be priorities. Getting a job is important. We all need a job. We like having jobs, but getting a job is not the purpose of education. But I would turn it around and I would ask the person who asked the question and everyone, how are we going to reconstruct education? This is really fundamental. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Tammy, for the question also. I will go and give the opportunity to Libardo Mota, que si quiere preguntar.
Hola, buenos días a todos. Mi nombre es Libardo Mota, desde Colombia. Les hablo desde Colombia. Quiero pues hacer como una inquietud a Paul. Si él cree que existen países dictadores disfrazados de democracia, en donde se es sometido el libre pensamiento y se pone en riesgo la vida, si no se está de acuerdo con las creencias y planteamientos del Estado, en donde la educación se ve como una amenaza y no como una vía en desarrollo. Gracias.
Gracias, Libardo. Creo que es un fenómeno, un problema en casi todos los países. La educación es una amenaza. ¿Por qué? Necesitamos pensar en la democracia, no en las elecciones y las estructuras normativas, pero en el involucramiento y la manifestación de la organización de una multitud de eventos y la cultura y las acciones y la inclusión y la participación. Entonces, ya dije al principio que yo vivo con esta paradoja que no me gustan las elecciones. No creo, pero yo participo. Entonces, es una droga o no sé, yo soy toxicomano, pero entonces necesitamos pensar que las elecciones es una pequeña parte de la democracia, no es la democracia. Porque hay violencia en la sociedad, porque hay femicidio, porque hay problemas de pobreza. Eso necesitamos reconstruir la solidaridad y no pensar que las elecciones es el punto final. Pero yo solo no tengo la respuesta. Es algo que necesitamos construir juntos con la solidaridad. Y necesitamos denunciar que no existe en la prensa oficial historias sobre la gente que están haciendo muchas cosas. Necesitamos continuar en las redes sociales, en los eventos como lo nuestro. Y yo creo que es muy grave la tendencia que podemos ver en algunos países ahora, que la dictadura regrese y que hay la potencialidad de eliminar gente. Podemos verlo con la pandemia. No me gusta mencionar algunos países, pero sabemos que es muy, muy grave. El racismo es algo de muy fuerte, femicidio y pobreza, pero yo creo que necesitamos poner fin a la militarización de nuestras sociedades. Y necesitamos hablar de eso, necesitamos denunciarlo. Vivimos en Canadá, hay armas que venden allá en Arabia Saudita y en Suecia. Entonces, vivimos con esta complicidad. Gracias, Libardo.
Thank you, Paul. We're gonna go with a last question before the break, and it's from Aditi Kulkarni. And just so you know that we have a happy hour at the end of the day at 3:30 Montreal time. So for the questions that we still have remaining, we will be able to talk about them later on today. So for the next question, politicians are also humans. They pretend to know everything or have knowledge of everything. Then how come they do not reflect social justice or transformative attitudes in them? Aren't they and the contributors of education system living in a paradox? You're on mute, Paul.
George Carlin, famous American humorist, said, "This is what we have. This is the best we have. This is our system." And without going into in detail, and I think when in the United States, they always say, we're better than this, we're better than this. No, we are this. And I think that people go into politics, many are very noble, they've got good values, they want to make a change. They arrive in the system and they realize the system wasn't made for this type of change. And I think many people go into education saying, I want to help, I want to engage, and then they realize that in education, I have to be tested, and One of the things that I've been told many times over the last 20 years, Jean and I, when we give presentations, it's very interesting, but we don't have time for social justice and democracy in education. Now they're saying this in a very serious way, but this is really sad and also kind of pathetic. I'm not blaming the person. So we've said our systems, our structures are not very democratic. And I think we have to start asking people more and more, where is the democracy that informs our education? What is it that we do in education that's democratic? And we have to ask principals and education ministers and bureaucrats. And if it's not democratic, then how do we build it? But we shouldn't start from the vantage point that we are already in a democracy. And I'm not trying to say that we don't do a lot of good things in formal institutions, but I think we need to force people at all levels to comment on how they believe that we are in a democracy. And if it's just elections, then we know that we are really in big trouble. Thank you. Thank you for that question.
Thank you so much. So just so you know, we have a break until 10:30. At 10:30, we have three different sessions, which is la démocratie, les droits de la personne et les mouvements sociaux au Brésil. We also have global citizenship and democracy in Asia, and democracia y desafíos en América Latina. And as I mentioned, we have the happy hour at the end of the day, so we will be able to get together and follow up with the questions and get back to all the subjects that are going to be shared today. And also something really important that I have to mention is on Friday, you'll be able to be a shooting star. As I said earlier, we're all the stars of this project, but on Friday, you'll be the shooting star because it's a workshop where you'll be able to share your thoughts and your project and really be a part of it. So you have to put that on your calendar. Okay, so yes, Paul?
If I just can have the last 20 seconds, I want to emphasize, just reading some of the comments, I believe firmly in education that this is our way forward and we have to really mobilize. There are many excellent examples of people developing projects in democratic classrooms and democratic initiatives. And often they're done on the margins and they're in the sidebars of faculties and in schools. But there are a lot of people who are very inspired, and everyone here, I'm sure, has had teachers who have inspired them. Perhaps teachers who have demoralized them as well, but teachers who have inspired them. And I think we have to really reignite the conversation on what the purpose of education is. So thank you so much. I think we've got 5 great days ahead of us where we're going to explore this. Thank you.